Today, we are back on the explorer's trail of traveling all of Northrend and seeing if this icy climate stands to test our mettle in uncovering terrain. We're going to cover every spot and not stop until we have a fully uncovered map from our travels without a flying mount. Stick around to determine which zone is the toughest and how many levels we gain. It's time for us to dust off this hat, zip up the boots, and make our way from frolic to foil through these 9 zones, as well as a little bonus that I've prepared for all of you. Starting at number 9, Crystal Song is a beautiful atmospheric looking forest in the smack dab in the middle of chaotic zones. It mainly serves as a spot to let Rand float about on a gameplay level, and if it weren't for Rand and maybe a few bits of quest here, there wouldn't be much of a reason to even go to this spot, let alone explore it, which is a shame because it does have a beautiful open atmosphere in this otherwise dreaded land. But since it serves as a filler spot at this point, similar to Moonglade and Devlin, I'll have to call it as it is and not give it a higher rating. If you're traversing this for yourself, expect a few ruins that hold a couple of spectered-like creatures and flight paths. I'll give it a 2 out of 10 for those results. Crystal Song is finished in around 11 minutes, but only steps up from here. Next at number 8, we've got Zuldrak as a split distinctive zone where the south is covered in decay, the north is being dominated by snow, and the trolls are putting each of their gods to the axe. Now the zone itself is pretty nicely laid out to the point where it's impressively lovely to explore, but there isn't much to gawk at for one making their way around the trail. There are a few spots where mobs are particularly condensed, and for those locations where they are, walking around them usually suffices to get you through to the next area. The layout can mainly be obtained by going along the outskirts with the occasional dip into the center to grab the spots like the Argent Stand or the Amphitheater. And sadly, no site sticks out as a spot that makes you think. So if you're looking for a well-built zone to waltz around in, then I suppose this zone is for you. But as we're explorers on the hunt for adventure and challenge, the spot is only getting a 5 out of 10 in frolicking difficulty. The wrap-up time also speaks for itself, just clocking in at 18 minutes. At number 7 on our difficulty meters, we have the enriching and comforting zone of Grizzly Hills. If you don't mind the mass infection of Oregon all over the place, that is. Now to understand if there's a spot you think that should take this place instead, as these few zones are similar in scaling difficulty. But Grizzly Hills takes this spot because it's similar to Zuldrak and that the trek here isn't full of condensed packed mobs or dangerous areas to be too concerned about for an explorer such as yourself. You can ease by most of these locations without a second thought, and since this is one of the more squished zones on the map, there's little need to dance around its layout, which is simplistic by nature. It does, however, get a slight bump up because there is an island. Yeah, let's make a return in these video. Its name is Blood Moon Isle, which sits on the northeast corner, and this island, should you choose to explore it thoroughly, could be dangerous to the inexperienced eye, but for us, merely getting in the range will suffice for map space. Still though, for such a zone, I'll give it a 6 out of 10 for the island, making us do a little swim work, but nothing outside of that is out of the way or too difficult to make it happen. We wrap up Grizzly Hills at around 22 minutes of travel time. Rounding off our lower half at number 6, we have Borean Tundra, which is one of the most quest-filled spots in Northrend outside of the endgame locations. For players like me would most likely tell you that they'd skip this place and go exploring for some other location. We put this on the lower end because while 2 islands exist here, the first is Caldera, which can be accessed via flight path within a quest, and the second one is more of a trek via swim, but it doesn't take as much effort once you get there. The dangers aren't really one to worry about either, so it's not really that bad, and its layout along with the double islands is just enough to land it above Grizzly Hills in terms of difficulty. However, rating wise, I tend not to go into decimal points, so this was one I'm going to go ahead and give a 6 out of 10 in traversing the tundra. Borean is wrapped up in around 26 minutes. Coming in at the number 5 spot, and technically the actual round up to the lower spots because, well, there are only 9 zones, so poor writing on my part there, we have Dragonflight. Now in terms of lore, Dragonflight is a significant part of Warcraft's history, and when you really think about it, the dragons and their impact on Azeroth before the Dragon Isles was really Dragonflight. They basically set it up as the primary location for the aspects that plan the course of the future. So it pains me to bring it lower on the list of exploration because of its significance. You could maybe have to run through camps to get to other spots, and areas like Naxxramas have many mobs surrounding their lower quarters, and it's more prominent than some spots on the map than the other previous 2 entries. But the problem is there isn't one specific spot to dig into, and I'd be lying if I didn't say there wasn't decently laid out zones with some mild challenging spots, so I guess I'll give it a 6 out of 10 on the scale. Nothing too overboard, just enough of a challenge to keep an explorer moving. Dragonblight is recorded and finished in about 24 minutes. This leads us to our next zone to hit the top 4 Northrend. Howling Fjord. The Fjord is likely the spot most players choose when considering their entry into Northrend, as the introduction to the Vrykul and the opening scenes for both Alliance and Horde have a robust setup. I remember doing these quests back when it was first released and thinking they were a fantastic zone setter to seeing how this new expansion would explore the depths of death and its impact on the world. But exploration-wise, it isn't entirely of a cakewalk either. The size and scale are comparable to Dragonblight's vast open feeling, but where Howling Fjord shines in difficulty is its layout. The location has several spots you need to climb up and jump down into to get what it provides, with the 2 faction starting spots being the prime example of acrobatic cliff dives. It also has 2 islands on the side of the fjord with a neat little elevator to get down from, but you still have to traverse the land a bit to uncover the fog of war entirely. Couple that with a few spots to avoid faction conflicts, and it could provide you some time that you'll need to check your corners to ensure the vast landmass is covered before trekking your next spot. Overall, I give this zone a 7 out of 10 because of the layout. With many expected jumps and climbing, you'll likely have to do some waltzing in this land. And it showed, as I had a time of 35 minutes before we were off to the next location. Now, onto the top 3 spots of the map. And if you're wondering where Winter Spring is going to fall, allow me to say that it's not an exploration requirements list, and also I'm pretty sure you can't get any experience for that place. But if I find data proving otherwise, I'll try to revisit it in a later episode as a sort of sorry I fucked up bonus. Now, our number 3 spot may shock you, but the area in question is in Sholazar Basin. Now, I'm not a fan of this spot, as I think it primarily exists outside of the tone and atmosphere of the rest of the zone's setup, and it's also one of the few spots where the Lich King doesn't really make an appearance. It also has 2 factions that, as far as I know, no one cares about. Go ahead and try to name them down below if you remember them. I bet you don't. I bet you, I just figured you just completely forgot about that right now. But it wouldn't be in the bronze spot if it didn't have something to offer us explorers, and trust me, it has 2 different challenges for us to face. The first is the water shuffle via the Stormright Shelf in the northwestern corner of the map. This location is seemingly difficult to get to without flying, and unless you're paying attention to the hint of fog war being barely visible, you may outright miss it. As it turns out, the easiest way to get this one under your belt is to go back through Borean Tundra to the northwest of the map and swim around the side of the basin up to the shelf. Once you do this, you'll have the way back towards the main crater-like structure and go on about your day. Now, while this is very island-like in its annoying setup, it still pales in comparison to the other spot of the map. Primarily, the Maker's Overlook, located in the direct east part of the map. Unlike the shelf, where you can swim over to it, the Overlook is designed for people to fly or do quests that elevates you to the spot. This results in most players believing that there's no way to progress upwards, and if you're playing the base game before scaling, you'll likely find it's near impossible without wasting much time. However, the current retail version of the game makes it more possible, or at least a little less dangerous. Off to the side of the Overlook is the Avalanche, covered in festering overspills of undead from Icecrown. We're talking absolute hordes covering every inch of this snowy part in an otherwise lush basin. However, this spot is our ticket to the Overlook. If you trek up on the slopes created by the snow while avoiding being eaten by the apparent amounts of danger, you can get to the very top of the basin walls, and from there, you can run over to where your character is standing just above the Overlook. Take a few smart jumps downwards, and your character has explored this beautiful but otherwise dull spot. So our first zone to give us a slightly harder time, and even if you're doing this on a scaled version of retail now offers, it still has a couple of hiccups. I did this as a druid because I have automatic heals while traveling, so I'll give it an 8 out of 10 for this spot alone, otherwise it'd be much lower on the list. With that marker, we can safely say we've finished up the basin in around 21 minutes. Now it's on to the final 2 spots on the map, which are both conveniently endgame locations for this expansion, and I'm sure you're wondering which zone has the coveted spot of being number 1 on this list. Well, friends, if you voted Icecrown as number 2, you'd be correct. Don't get me wrong though, the pinnacle of the Lich King power packs quite a punch for anyone daring to trek through these icy cold domains. Why did I put so many P's there? Everything about Icecrown is brilliantly done, and to this day, it's still one of the best layout zones I've had the pleasure of walking through as both an explorer and a quester invested in the Wrath of the Lich King storyline. There's just so much about this place to love, and I could gush on it for a while, but I want this to come out at some point, so I'll get to why this is number 2 on the list. For starters, this layout is completely covered in undead mounts from pretty much every single angle. There is little in the way of resting spots like many zones you'll see throughout your travels. Although most zones have the occasional site here and there that feels tightly compacted, they tend to have some leeway to them. Here on the other hand, if you're going to a location like the Broken Front, you better believe this has something to avoid or admire, depending on what your preference is. The layout also provides a challenge, as the Citadel and its expansion of bridges provide one top location to cover, while the floor is another setup entirely. And just because you're walking a bridge doesn't mean you're scot-free of something taking a nasty bite out of your health, as elites are still rampant in this zone. They're all over the place, let me tell you. Also, some places are outright challenging to get to without flying. It isn't like the one spot in Sholazar's Basin, but rather it has several spots because it's a vast open world that makes you feel like you're climbing up landscapes of ice, even though you have to get to a location that looks like an entirely empty plateau. But then once you get to the plateau, there's more enemies for you to deal with, so you essentially have a lot of stuff going on here. The only place that feels like a safe haven is the tournament grounds, which you'll want to get as soon as possible so you can traverse the mountainside from one of its highest points. But who could also forget that this place, if it needed to be more complex, also had to throw in an island off the map via the Scarlet Onslaught's efforts to combat the undead menace. And this island isn't just one where you can walk up and not have anything to do with it, because once you go down there, getting back up there is done by swimming to a spot where there's a cliff face to climb, good luck doing that by the way, flying, or letting yourself be killed off by the most incompetent light dwellers in the game. If that doesn't make you feel like you failed on some level as an explorer, I don't know what will. But this location has so much to it that it's fun to explore and provides a solid challenge for players who dare cover its face without using the wings to cheese these locations. locations. As such, you can't help but feel like you're immersed in the atmosphere of this world, and the combat, layout, and islands give it a solid 9 out of 10 without having it be artificially hard to explore via an impossible floating island up the coast of an otherwise accessible zone. Looking at you, Outlands. As such, Ice Crown took us about 40 minutes to explore before getting to the #1 spot on our difficulty meters. Now, for the moment you've all been waiting for. Storm Peaks takes the reins as the most challenging spot to trek in Northrend. We're now left with the biggest question in the form of one word. How? How do you go to multiple spots seemingly littered with places where the only way to get from one location to another is by getting your magical horse fairy thing, or whatever it is now, and fluttering over towards the desired terrain? Well, friends, strap in, because it's going to be a wild ride. First and foremost is the very beginning of access to the zone. You have 2 or 3 spots to cover before the game asks you to climb up a mountain and reach the rest of the zone's unlockable spots. Now this is where the flying mentioned above comes into play. When they give you the mount, you can just zip up there without any issues. But since that's not our option, we only have one way forward: to climb the mountaintop and meet the villagers above as best as possible. Now Blizzard did try to make this near impossible to do, and if you're a class that doesn't have a way to boost momentum upwards in some capacity, then this becomes 10 times harder for you. Still, in my case, I had a particular set of scenarios I needed to make this occur. For this to work for me, I needed something like a charge or a quick booster to help me kick upwards to some of the steeper locations that you couldn't just trek without using the boost. And after doing a little inspection on the class to see what options were available, as spoilers, I didn't have wild charge yet, I came up with a solution. Typically in runs, I turn on war mode for these sorts of challenges, and in this case, it didn't really matter until I got to this zone. My goal was to run Guardian Druid because Guardian Druids get a PvP talent named Overrun, where they can charge forward on a target at a max distance of 25 yards. And in theory, if any mobs were close enough for me to charge once I got to a specific cliff face, I could charge them and use that momentum to continue trekking upwards after the charge. Initially, this seemed not to matter, as even when I got up a decent amount, the Yetis, to get me further up, were too far away from my charge ability to even come close to hitting them. That, however, was when I tried something else that was peculiar. If you watched the Outlands video, you'll recall I mentioned doing a turnip charge, where if I could set the turnip down far enough away, I could use it to charge up and make the forward momentum to push that spot that would otherwise be impossible without using a booster. Well, even though I said it seemed like vertical play and turnips were out of the question, I can happily, might I add, say that the information I gave was wrong. It turns out the turnip mechanics work more on surface areas, not necessarily heights of locations, meaning so long as the surface is flat enough, and I mean pixel flat enough, you can theoretically place a turnip above you to make this work. And that's precisely what I did here. I put a turnip just above me and then charged it and went as far up as possible before hitting another roadblock. But now I was in range of the Yetis on the mountainside, and with one CD reset, I charged them and continued to move upwards. I did this one more time before I finally got close to Brunhildar village near the top of the spot where I could go to explore. But this is where I hit another snag. There are no enemies to charge on the boardwalk going into the village, and even if there was, I'd probably not be close enough to range, as in theory, the passage is too far away from the cliffside for that to become possible. But in this running around of thought, I realized and remembered something that essentially was a free pass to some of the more difficult spots to reach. I remembered graveyard skips. Yes, these will play a critical role as they did in Blade Edge Mountains. Unlike Blade Edge, however, we'll be using them much more generously and fluently to our success. One thing to note is that a graveyard is near my location on the cliffside, and it just so happens that if I'm closer to that one than the one back in K3, I could potentially die and resurrect near Brunhildar village, aka the top spot of Storm Peaks. So I ran upwards, jumped off a small cliff a couple of times, and did this until my character finally collapsed of broken kneecap syndrome. And wouldn't you know it, the landing spot for my wisp just so happened to be right above the cliff face. Once resurrected, I was home free to explore the rest of the zone. But fun fact, this does not mean the rest of the zone is just effortless now. It in fact had a lot of issues, and you're pretty much going to expect a lot of places where graveyard manipulation is not only desired, but required. Now, I could go on about the entire zone because it was a trek and a half trying to figure out what I could do with this location. But considering I spent 2 pages on the script focusing on a cliffside, I'll try to keep the big highlights in instead. That being Ulduar, Frosthold, and the Temple of Storms. First, Ulduar is essentially like a gigantic island. Sure, it's got a technical chasm that somewhat connects it to the rest of the peaks, but come on, if not island, why island shaped? So as the mother of all islands, you can expect that this location isn't a cakewalk to get to. And because it's sort of like an Outlands island, it's near impossible to get to unless you meet specific requirements, like flying. So instead, here's where another graveyard step is needed to get to this location. First off, you need to get as close to Ulduar as possible, as there are 3 different graveyards in this spot, and if you die too close to one of them, you'll have to retry this again. Thankfully, on my first attempt, I could run out far enough to where the Ulduar graveyard picked me up. Essentially, the chasm near the right side has one spot where you can explore Ulduar, and because it's marked as part of it, the character dies and is sent to the raid's graveyard. But even when you get here, Ulduar isn't done with you yet, because now you had to get off the island and towards another graveyard. Thankfully, there is a bridge that connects Ulduar and the Temple of Wisdom on the left side of the map, where you can fall off of it, go around the temple, and then jump off again as far as you can from the previous graveyard to spawn at the Snowdrift Plains graveyard and bring you closer to the two complex locations to get to it. Now for Frosthold. Initially, this place was a little bit tougher for me, as getting here without flying seemed impossible. There is a hill that is just high enough to where if you can trek the mountain face and then die to a couple of aggroed harpies, they can put you just high enough on the scale to potentially get you to that spot of your dreams. A flat enough surface to where you can graze the outskirts of Frosthold. And when I say graze it, I do mean skim it, because the actual city itself is seemingly off limits. After all, the walls are just slightly too steep for a Skyrim horse to climb. That part was a little less complicated and more about finding the exact spot to make it happen. Temple of Storms, however, has a different story in mind. And if you're a horde and looking to get the Grommash crash site for this video, don't worry, I've got you here with this route. So your Temple of Storms is one of those few spots your character can't just look up and say, "Oh, that's a temple! And it's stormy! Oh, Temple of Storms!" No, you've got to try to find a way to trek it up at least halfway to stand a chance. Get ready, because this is going to be good. Now, I'd be lying if I said I found this out on my own. I only really refined it to work as best as I could for my druid in this scenario. There's a YouTuber that shows off a route without commentary, so if you want to see it, check it out. But to do this, you must go back to Ulduar to a particular spot called the Inventor's Library. It's facing essentially reflective of the face of Ulduar. From there, you can find these two library guardians. Get to the close side as close as possible so you can die, and use the spirit flying to get to the top of this building at the Terrace of the Makers. From there, climb the building's roof and go up to the cliff face to the closest mountainside. This is where the horde can discover Grommash crash site, as you run right by it on the way to the Temple of Storms route. Regardless of your faction, you must run past this point to get to the next part. Alliance, I found, can go off to the right side to attempt to avoid as much as possible. Once this is done, the final part begins. A debris pile sits just on the outskirts of the ramp, and from there, there's this somewhat steep sleeve of snow that stretched out before you with a couple of trees. Why did I put so many S's in there? I swear to God. Your goal at this point is to slowly traverse the bits and patterns of programmed spots for you to run along this steep slope and get as far as possible. So you need to smush your face against the rock, push for some spots as you gingerly go right, and keep going until it seems like the snow is mostly gone, and all that's left is the rocky face below. Then from there, you need to point yourself diagonally towards the rock face and make the jump. If you do this right, Temple of Storms should appear on your map before you fall off and likely die. So this is how you get Temple of Storms, and boy, oh boy, was this zone a trek. This layout is ludicrous for anyone looking to do this without a flying mount, and I'm almost tempted to give it the full 10 points because of its complexity and need for strategy, but because it's 100% possible to do, unlike Blade's Edge, I'd have to bump it down by giving it half a point, so this is my first 9.5 out of 10. I'm giving Storm Peaks a bravo for such an epic adventure though. Good job, Storm Peaks. The time speaks for itself here, as after an hour of travel, we've managed to get to that last bit of land to traverse. And once again, that would be the end of it, but hold on. I promised to do something, didn't I? Perhaps, maybe a bit of some unreleased footage. Well, my friends, it's time I deliver to you one of the biggest secrets I've been hiding for the exploration series thus far. You see, I've been giving some details on the route regarding why I didn't explore areas like Highjaw, Twilight's Highlands, Vashir, and the others during my time on Azeroth's prominent Two Faces. I've been saying that it's because of different expansions, so technically it doesn't fall under the same category. But I feel like I should go ahead and open up with the reasoning a little more now that the Cataclysm zones are, allegedly, next on the chopping block. For this reason, we need to go back to the initial footage of Kalimdor and show off a run where there's an initial attempt on a specific zone that dramatically shifted the plan of the challenge. Because initially, I was going to do these runs with their retrospective spots. Yes, I had intended to do Highjaw, Highlands, and the other zones outright, all together. But there was a problem when doing them, and what better way to show that off than to give you a glimpse into the start of the Mount Highjaw run. Let's look back at a simpler time. We had just finished Winter Spring, and I was only level 8, still in my BOA gear, running around on a motorcycle. Well, at that final junction to exploring Wintergrasp, I knew that getting to Highjaw was only one canyon away, and so after trekking it on foot, I eventually settled on doing the very first resurrection release manipulation by jumping into the canyon and rezzing right next to a vast zone of Mount Highjaw. So I went traversing the ever-rising mountain, getting spots as usual. Mount Highjaw I knew would be difficult because mobs here are a minimum of level 30, while I was only level 8. What happened though shocked even me. Everything was going fine for the first half of making my way through until I got to the Flame Throne and Flame Wake in the southern half. This is where I encountered mobs that critically and quickly killed off my character. No surprises, I figured it'd happen. But what I didn't expect was where my release point would be. I assumed I'd get a wisp somewhere in the middle of Mount Highjaw and I would have to fly back. However, I instead found myself stuck in Ashenvale and forced to watch as Mount Highjaw became impossible and out of my range for my character's exploring grasp. Defeated on options besides running all the way back, I had to take the Spirit Healer and continue to Ajara, changing how this run would go with an additional couple of episodes regarding just the Cataclysm zones. What to take away from this is that until you're level 30, you don't get access to the graveyards of the Cata respected zones. If I die even once, I'm forced out of that spot into another place, likely far away from my corpse. So for everyone curious as to why I chose to break down the zones in such a way, that's why. And what's more, if you saw my final level in Ice Crown, by the way, comment down below our last level, you'll realize that even at this ascended level, I am still not high enough to access the Cataclysm zones. So following this exploration zone will not be Cataclysm, but instead we'll be going to Pandaria's harsh, desolate lands. Watch this if it's already on screen, otherwise watch this if you want the previous episode.